The first letter burned faster than Evelyn expected. The edges curled inward with quiet certainty, blackening before dissolving into pale orange light that reflected across the polished stone fireplace of Ravenshire estate. She stood perfectly still, unable to look away as carefully chosen words disappeared into ash one sentence at a time. Every servant in the room remained silent. Mrs. Ellis held her hands tightly together near the doorway. The butler stared toward the windows as though the snow outside deserved his complete attention. Even the fire seemed reluctant to disturb the moment. Damian Ashford watched the flames without expression. Another sealed envelope rested between his fingers. Another farewell he had written for a future he no longer wished to accept. "Your Grace," Mrs. Ellis finally whispered, her voice carrying more concern than protocol, "those documents took months to prepare." Damian turned the envelope once before placing it into the fire beside the first. The wax seal softened almost immediately. "That is precisely why they should never be used." The word settled over the room with surprising calm. Evelyn looked at him carefully. 2 days earlier he had spoken like a man arranging the final pieces of his own disappearance. Today something inside him had shifted. The exhaustion remained. The pale color had not left his face. The occasional roughness in his breathing still lingered beneath every quiet pause. Yet another quality had replaced the resignation she had come to recognize. Resistance. Outside, endless white snow covered the ancient grounds of Ravenshire, turning the estate into a silent kingdom beneath the grey December sky. Inside the library, a dying duke calmly destroyed every plan he had made for dying. Mrs. Ellis hesitated. "Should I summon Mr. Hargrove from the solicitor's office?" Damian shook his head once. "No. He will expect instructions. Then he will learn to expect uncertainty." Evelyn could not stop herself from smiling very slightly. It was such an unfamiliar answer that even Damian appeared faintly surprised by hearing himself say it aloud. He reached for another stack of prepared correspondence resting neatly upon the desk. Medical directives. Estate transfers. Personal instructions. Carefully organized architecture for a future built without him. His hand paused before touching them. Evelyn crossed the room slowly until she stood beside him. The warmth of the fire softened the winter chill carried through the old stone walls. She glanced toward the top document. Her own name appeared in Damian's precise handwriting. Lady Evelyn Ravenshire. Protected in perpetuity. She looked back toward him. "You do not have to burn everything." His grey eyes remained fixed on the papers. "No." "Then why are you doing it?" Silence stretched between them while snow drifted gently beyond the tall windows. At last he answered without looking at her. "Because I spent too many months preparing for a life that continues without me." Evelyn waited. Damian rarely offered more than one truth at a time. Finally he exhaled slowly. "I have realized something unpleasant." "What is that?" He lifted his eyes toward hers. They still carried fatigue, but beneath it rested something far less fragile. "I have been disappearing long before death ever arrives." The simplicity of the confession unsettled her more deeply than dramatic declarations ever could. She remembered the unopened letters hidden inside her writing desk. She remembered nights spent listening to him speak about consequences instead of hope. She remembered every conversation shaped around absence instead of tomorrow. For the first time since their marriage, Damian was not planning for loss. He was recognizing it. Mrs. Ellis quietly dismissed the remaining servants until only the three of them remained in the vast library. The old house seemed to breathe again as footsteps faded into distant corridors. Damian gathered the remaining envelopes into one stack. Evelyn noticed his fingers hesitate for only a moment before dropping them into the fire. The flames rose brighter. Years of careful preparation disappeared within minutes. Mrs. Ellis blinked rapidly and looked away. "His Grace has never changed his mind once a decision was made," she murmured softly. Damian allowed himself the faintest trace of dry humor. "Perhaps that has always been the problem." Evelyn studied him in silence. Every instinct told her not to interrupt whatever invisible battle had finally reached its conclusion. Instead, she stepped closer until they stood side by side before the fire. The sleeves of their dark clothing almost touched. Neither of them moved away. Outside, Ravenshire remained buried beneath fresh snow. Somewhere in the eastern wing an old clock announced the hour with slow, deliberate chimes. Damian listened until the final note disappeared. Then he spoke quietly enough that only Evelyn could hear. "I am tired of preparing to disappear." She felt something tighten unexpectedly inside her chest. There were countless responses she could have offered. Comfort. Encouragement. Reassurance. Instead, she answered with complete honesty. "Then stay." He closed his eyes briefly. When they opened again, the distance she had grown accustomed to seemed fractionally smaller. "I do not know how," he admitted. Evelyn reached toward the desk where one unopened letter remained forgotten beneath a leather folder. She picked it up carefully and held it between them. "Perhaps you begin by writing a different ending." Damian looked at the envelope but did not take it. "You always make impossible things sound practical." "Someone has to." A quiet sound escaped him. Not quite laughter. Closer than she had ever heard before. Mrs. Ellis turned discreetly toward the window, pretending not to notice. The moment lasted only seconds, yet it changed the atmosphere of the room in ways no one could fully explain. The fire continued burning through the final farewell letters until nothing remained except pale grey ash. Damian watched the last fragment collapse inward. "There is still one problem." Evelyn folded her hands calmly. "Only one." Another trace of dry amusement touched his expression. "The investigation." The word immediately altered the air between them. Evelyn remembered every unfinished conversation surrounding Catherine. Every hidden document. Every strange hesitation whenever Ravenshire's past entered discussion. She looked toward the massive desk dominating the center of the library. "You believe someone has been manipulating events for years?" "Yes." "And you intend to prove it?" He nodded once. "If I continue assuming I will die soon, then everyone waiting for that outcome already possesses an advantage." Evelyn considered him for a long moment. "So you intend to become inconvenient?" This time the almost smile remained a fraction longer. "Extremely inconvenient." Mrs. Ellis slowly approached the desk carrying a small wooden box that Evelyn had never noticed before. The polished walnut surface showed signs of age. Silver corners reflected the firelight. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "there is something I hesitated to mention while the physician remained here." Damian turned toward her. "What is it?" She placed the box upon the desk and lifted the lid. Inside rested bundles of correspondence tied with faded blue ribbon. Estate reports. Receipts. Personal notes. And one narrow leather folder noticeably thinner than the others. Mrs. Ellis lowered her gaze. "Someone entered the archive 3 nights ago." Evelyn felt immediate tension settle across the room. "Was anything stolen?" Mrs. Ellis hesitated. "Only one file." Damian's posture remained perfectly still. "Which file?" The housekeeper looked directly at him. "The private investigation concerning Lady Catherine Ashford." Silence followed so completely that the crackling fire suddenly sounded impossibly loud. Evelyn slowly turned toward Damian. She expected anger, shock, frustration. Instead, she found absolute focus. The resignation that had defined him for months was gone. In its place stood the Duke of Ravenshire, observant and quietly formidable despite the illness still hidden beneath composed shoulders. He rested one hand against the desk while studying the nearly empty box. "Who knew it existed?" Mrs. Ellis answered immediately. "Only 4 people." "You?" "Yes." "Myself?" "Yes." "The family solicitor?" "Yes." Damian's eye settled upon the final empty space where a file should have rested. "And the person who took it?" Snow pressed softly against the tall windows while winter light slowly faded beyond the ancient estate. Somewhere far across the grounds a lone raven lifted into the pale sky, leaving a single dark shape against endless white. Evelyn reached for Damian's hand without thinking. This time he did not hesitate. His fingers closed gently around hers, warm despite the cold surrounding Ravenshire. He continued looking toward the empty place inside the box as though every unanswered question from the past had suddenly become part of the present. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady enough to quiet every uncertainty in the room. Someone believed I would never ask another question. He looked toward Evelyn, and for the first time since she had met him, determination stood where surrender had always lived. They were wrong. Morning arrived quietly over Ravenshire estate, but the silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt observant. Fresh snow covered the gardens in smooth white layers that erased every path except one narrow trail leading toward the Eastern Archive building. Evelyn stood beside the library window holding a cup of untouched tea while pale winter light spread slowly across the frozen grounds. Behind her, Damian sat at the long oak table surrounded by ledgers that had not been opened in years. The fire burned steadily, yet the room carried an unfamiliar energy. For the first time since their marriage, the Duke of Ravenshire was making plans that belonged to the future instead of preparing for the end. His fingers rested upon a faded leather journal marked only with a single silver letter. See, he had not opened it. Not yet. Evelyn turned from the window and walked toward him. You have been staring at that book for nearly 20 minutes. Damian lifted his eyes. The exhaustion remained beneath them, softened only by a quiet determination that seemed stronger than physical strength. I am deciding whether memory deserves another chance. Evelyn sat across from him and gently pushed the journal closer. Perhaps memory has been waiting longer than either of us realized. A faint breath escaped him before he untied the worn ribbon holding the pages together. The paper had yellowed with time. Catherine's handwriting flowed across the first page with remarkable confidence, elegant but unmistakably practical. There were no declarations of romance. No dramatic reflections. Only observations. December 3rd. Mr. Whitmore visited again. He smiled too much when speaking about inheritance. Damian frowned almost immediately. Evelyn leaned closer. Read the next one. December 9th. I asked for copies of the Western estate accounts. The clerk insisted they had already been removed by parliamentary review. No review was scheduled. Someone lied. Snow continued drifting outside while the old clock in the corridor counted each passing minute. Damian turned another page. Catherine's writing remained calm even as her thoughts became increasingly unsettled. December 14th. Mrs. Ellis believes I worry too easily. I hope she is correct. Yet every conversation ends when I enter a room. Every servant grows quiet when Ravenshire finances become the subject. I have begun keeping notes because memory alone no longer feels reliable. Evelyn slowly looked toward Damian. She knew something was wrong. He nodded once without taking his eyes from the journal. Long before I did. The realization settled heavily between them. Catherine had never appeared frightened in the stories Damian shared. She had always existed as kindness preserved inside grief. Now another version emerged from the fading pages. Intelligent. Careful. Quietly suspicious. A woman trying to understand invisible movements beneath ordinary aristocratic life. Damian turned another page and stopped. A small rectangle of folded paper slipped free and landed upon the desk. Evelyn picked it up carefully. It was not a letter. It was half of a receipt bearing the crest of Ashbourne Legal Registry. The lower section had been torn away years before. Across the remaining portion appeared one handwritten note. Delivered personally to Bernard Whitmore. Evelyn read the words twice before placing the paper beside the journal. Why would Catherine keep this? Damian's expression grew thoughtful. Because she believed it mattered. Mrs. Ellis entered without disturbing the silence, carrying another wooden box recovered from the lower archive. Your Grace, I searched every cabinet after breakfast. She placed the box upon the table. There is something else missing. Damian looked toward her. What? A visitor ledger? Evelyn frowned slightly. Who would steal a list of names? Mrs. Ellis answered with quiet certainty. Someone who does not wish to be remembered. No one spoke for several moments. The fire cracked softly while snow tapped against the windows in slow, patient rhythms. Damian finally reached for another journal resting beneath Catherine's notes. Unlike the first, this volume contained no daily observations. Every page listed dates beside names. Estate managers, solicitors, trustees, members of Parliament. Small marks appeared beside some entries. Circles beside others. At the center of one page, Catherine had drawn a simple question. Why do the same three men appear whenever Ravenshire property is discussed? Evelyn followed the names carefully. Bernard Whitmore, Arthur Ellison, Charles Fenwick. She looked toward Damian. Did you know them all? Yes. Did Catherine? Only socially. Evelyn studied the page again. Then why would she connect them? Damian closed the journal slowly. Because she noticed patterns while I accepted routines. His answer carried no bitterness. Only regret. Mrs. Ellis quietly unfolded another document she had discovered beneath the ledger box. It contained a short list written in Catherine's hand. If anything happens to me, tell Damian to look in the blue cabinet. Damian immediately stood. The movement cost him more effort than he intended to reveal. His hand rested briefly against the edge of the table until the moment of weakness passed. Evelyn noticed but chose not to interrupt. She simply moved beside him as they crossed the library together. The blue cabinet stood in a narrow alcove hidden behind shelves of estate histories. Dust covered the brass handle. Damian unlocked it with a small key hanging from his watch chain. Inside rested only three objects. A sealed envelope. A dried white camellia pressed between parchment sheets. And one missing diary page folded into perfect quarters. Evelyn unfolded it carefully. Catherine's handwriting remained steady until the final sentence. Someone entered Father's office after midnight. They were not looking for money. They searched only the inheritance records. If Damian discovers this journal, tell him I do not believe accidents happen as often as gentlemen prefer to claim. The page ended there. Nothing followed. No explanation. No accusation. Only unfinished certainty preserved through ink and silence. Damian lowered himself slowly into the nearby chair without speaking. Evelyn remained standing beside him, holding the fragile page as though the paper itself carried the weight of another woman's unfinished voice. At last Damian reached toward the pressed white camellia resting inside the cabinet. He touched the delicate petals with surprising care. She always placed one in the library every winter. Evelyn glanced toward him. You never told me that. I stopped remembering details that made surviving more difficult. She looked from the flower to the journal spread across the desk. Perhaps surviving became more difficult because you stopped remembering them. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he accepted the diary page from her hands and read the final sentence once more. When he finally looked up, something had changed again. Not dramatic resolve. Something quieter. The slow return of trust in his own judgment. Outside, the wind shifted across Ravenshire, carrying loose snow through the bare branches surrounding the estate. A raven settled upon the stone fountain before lifting into the pale afternoon sky. Mrs. Ellis stepped toward the window, her expression thoughtful. Your Grace. Damian followed her gaze. Fresh carriage tracks now crossed the front drive, cutting through snow that had remained untouched since dawn. No visitor had announced an arrival. No servant had opened the gates. Yet someone had approached the estate and turned away without stopping. Evelyn walked closer until she could clearly see the distant marks disappearing beyond the northern road. Her voice remained calm, though uncertainty rested beneath every word. Someone knows we started asking questions. Damian stood beside her. This time he did not look toward the fading tracks. His attention rested upon the unopened envelope Catherine had hidden years before. Across the front, written in perfectly measured handwriting, appeared only 6 quiet words that seemed to erase the warmth from the entire room. "If this reaches you, I was right." Snow had stopped by the time the Ravenshire carriage rolled through the gates of Ashbourne Hall, but the city still wore winter like polished silver beneath a pale afternoon sky. Frost clung to every iron railing. Gas lamps waited unlit along the wide avenue while elegant carriages formed orderly lines before the grand entrance. Evelyn looked through the window without speaking. London society always appeared beautiful from a distance. Up close, it possessed a remarkable talent for disguising curiosity as kindness. Damian rested across from her, dressed in black wool that emphasized the quiet sharpness of his features. The journey had exhausted him more than he admitted. She noticed the slight pause before every deeper breath and the way his hand remained loosely closed around his gloves as though conserving strength had become instinct. Neither of them mentioned it. Instead, Evelyn unfolded Catherine's unopened envelope once more. They had waited until the carriage departed Ravenshire before breaking the seal. The letter inside contained only a single page. No signature. No farewell. Only careful observations written with calm certainty. "If you are reading this, then someone finally decided my questions became inconvenient. Do not trust conversations that begin with concern for Ravenshire. They always end with concern for control. Watch Bernard Whitmore when inheritance becomes the subject. He looks at people the way accountants look at columns of numbers." Damian had read those lines 6 times before quietly returning the letter to her. He still carried the memory in silence. The carriage slowed before the entrance. A footman opened the door immediately. Warm light spilled across polished stone steps while music drifted through the towering windows above. Evelyn accepted Damian's arm. His posture remained composed, yet she felt the brief hesitation hidden beneath controlled movement. He noticed her concern and lowered his voice. "I'm still capable of walking into a ballroom," she answered without looking away from the entrance. "I know. I simply prefer that you walk out of it as well." Something softened in his expression before the moment disappeared beneath aristocratic composure. The announcement echoed through the great hall. "Their Graces, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshire." Conversation paused exactly as Evelyn expected. Hundreds of carefully educated voices suddenly discovered silence at the same moment. Crystal chandeliers reflected against marble floors while members of London's highest families turned with practiced elegance toward the newly arrived couple. Some smiled politely. Others measured Damian with open curiosity. A few looked genuinely surprised to see him standing at all. Lady Winthrop approached first, dressed in deep emerald silk and carrying enough diamonds to rival the chandeliers overhead. She bowed gracefully toward Damian before offering Evelyn an approving smile. "Your Grace, London appears delighted that unpleasant rumors have exaggerated your condition." Damian returned the greeting with perfect calm. Rumors often work harder than physicians. A quiet ripple of restrained amusement passed through the surrounding guests. Lady Winthrop moved on. Others immediately replaced her. Questions arrived disguised as compliments. Observations disguised as sympathy. Every conversation somehow drifted toward health, succession, inheritance, or the future of Ravenshire. Evelyn understood Catherine's warning more clearly with each passing minute. Concern always seemed to arrive carrying invisible calculations. Music filled the ballroom as couples began the opening waltz. Damian remained near one of the tall windows overlooking the winter gardens. He rarely sought attention, yet attention found him anyway. Lord Cunningham approached carrying a champagne glass and the confident smile of a man accustomed to speaking before thinking. "Your Grace," he began pleasantly, "it is remarkable to see you recovering so well. Parliament was nearly convinced Ravenshire would soon require administrative assistance." Several nearby guests immediately became interested in their own conversations while quietly listening. Damian regarded him with steady grey eyes. "How fortunate that Parliament does not determine my pulse." Cunningham laughed awkwardly. "Of course. Merely administrative speculation." Speculation has an unfortunate habit of becoming ambition. The older nobleman shifted slightly before excusing himself with visible relief. Evelyn glanced toward Damian. You have become considerably less accommodating. He accepted a glass of water from a passing servant. Perhaps I finally realized accommodation is not the same as kindness. Before she could answer, another voice interrupted from behind them. Bernard Whitmore stood only a few feet away, impeccably dressed and entirely composed. Silver threaded through his dark hair, lending him an appearance of quiet authority that might have inspired confidence in anyone who had never looked closely into his eyes. He bowed politely. Your Grace. It is encouraging to see you in such excellent spirits. Damian met the greeting without visible emotion. Mr. Whitmore. Bernard turned toward Evelyn with practiced warmth. Your Grace, London speaks highly of your remarkable grace under unusual circumstances. Evelyn smiled with equal politeness. London has always enjoyed unusual stories. His expression flickered almost imperceptibly before recovering. Indeed. Silence settled briefly among the three of them while music continued beneath crystal light. Bernard finally glanced toward Damian. I understand several estate reviews have recently resumed. They have. May I assume professional assistance will no longer be necessary? Damian looked directly at him. You may assume Ravenshire will continue governing itself. Bernard inclined his head. Naturally. Yet something beneath his calm exterior seemed to sharpen. At that moment a young gentleman hurried across the ballroom carrying a folded document sealed with parliamentary blue wax. He stopped beside Bernard and whispered something too quietly for anyone else to hear. Bernard accepted the paper and glanced down. His expression changed only slightly. Too slightly. Evelyn noticed anyway. He folded the document once and slipped it into his pocket. Then he offered another measured bow. Please enjoy the evening. He departed without waiting for conversation. Evelyn watched him disappear into the crowd. He was disappointed. Damian nodded once. Yes. Because you are standing here. Because I am asking questions. Music shifted into a slower arrangement while servants opened the doors leading toward the conservatory. Guests drifted toward refreshments and quieter conversation beneath glass ceilings covered by delicate patterns of frost. Evelyn walked beside Damian through the elegant corridor lined with winter roses grown despite the season. The scent remained faint but unmistakable. White camellias stood among them. Catherine's favorite flower. Damian stopped without warning before one arrangement placed beside an antique marble bench. A small card rested beneath the blossoms. For Lady C. In everlasting memory. Evelyn gently picked up the card. There was no signature. Only a tiny pressed silver crest she had seen once before inside Catherine's journal beside the name Bernard Whitmore. Her pulse slowed. Damian. He accepted the card carefully. His expression remained calm, yet she noticed his fingers tighten almost invisibly around the edge. He still sends flowers. Every year. Apparently. They stood in silence until footsteps approached from the opposite side of the conservatory. An elderly woman carrying a carved walking stick paused when she recognized Damian. Lady Harcourt had long retired from public life, yet every aristocrat still treated her observations as though Parliament itself had spoken. She smiled kindly toward Evelyn before studying Damian with remarkable directness. You look more alive than the last time I saw you. Damian inclined his head. I appreciate the improvement. She stepped closer and lowered her voice. Then do not waste it. Her gaze shifted toward the white camellias. Your first Duchess asked difficult questions. People dislike difficult women until history proves they were correct. Evelyn felt every word settle into the quiet air. Lady Harcourt continued without hesitation. She visited me 2 weeks before she became ill. Damian remained perfectly still. She did? Yes. The older woman's eyes softened with memory. She believed certain estate papers had been altered after your father's passing. She intended to compare copies stored in my family's archive. Evelyn exchanged a quick glance with Damian. Lady Harcourt noticed immediately. She never returned for them. The orchestra began another waltz somewhere beyond the glass walls, yet the music suddenly felt impossibly distant. Damian spoke carefully. "Do those papers still exist?" Lady Harcourt looked toward the ballroom where dozens of elegant conversations continued beneath golden light. Then she reached inside her evening shawl and withdrew a small brass key worn smooth by time. She placed it gently into Evelyn's hand. "West Harcourt Library. 3rd floor. Blue cabinet." Her voice lowered almost to a whisper. "And if anyone asks why you are visiting, tell them you came for poetry." Before either of them could answer, she turned and disappeared into the gathering crowd with surprising speed. Evelyn looked down at the old key resting against her glove. Its surface carried a tiny engraved symbol identical to the one Catherine had marked beside 3 mysterious names in her journal. Damian stared after Lady Harcourt for a long silent moment. Then his attention shifted toward the far end of the ballroom where Bernard Whitmore stood watching them across the distance. Their eyes met only briefly before Bernard calmly raised his champagne glass in polite acknowledgement. Evelyn felt a quiet certainty settle into place inside her mind. Catherine had not imagined invisible patterns. She had followed them. And now someone had realized Damian and Evelyn had begun following them too. The brass key felt unexpectedly warm inside Evelyn's glove as the Ravenshire carriage crossed the quiet streets of Mayfair before sunrise. London had not fully awakened yet. A thin layer of frost covered the cobblestones, and the first rays of pale winter light reflected from rows of elegant windows that still guarded their secrets behind heavy curtains. Damian sat beside her instead of across from her this time. Neither of them had suggested the change. It had simply happened when the carriage door opened, leaving less distance than either of them would have chosen only weeks before. He held Catherine's journal carefully upon his lap while the folded letter rested inside his coat pocket. Every piece of evidence seemed strangely fragile against the enormous questions waiting ahead. The carriage stopped before a townhouse built from pale stone and quiet confidence. West Harcourt Library occupied 3 connected buildings hidden behind wrought iron gates and evergreen hedges dusted with snow. No sign announced its existence. No visitors waited outside. The place resembled a private residence more than an archive containing generations of aristocratic history. An elderly caretaker opened the door before they reached the steps. His silver hair matched the winter sky, and his expression remained perfectly neutral until he noticed the small brass key resting in Evelyn's hand. Something changed immediately. He stepped aside without asking a single question. "Lady Harcourt expected you," he said softly. "Please follow me." Warmth surrounded them as soon as the heavy doors closed behind their backs. Thousands of books filled towering shelves that reached toward painted ceilings. Old clocks whispered through distant rooms. Dust floated gently in narrow beams of morning light. The caretaker guided them across polished floors and up 3 winding staircases until they reached a quiet corridor lined with blue wooden cabinets. He stopped before the final door. "Everything inside belongs to memory," he said. "Memory has an unfortunate habit of surviving people." Damian studied the old man carefully. "Did you know Catherine?" The caretaker nodded once. "She visited twice." "Did she find what she wanted?" A faint sadness crossed the older man's face. "I believe she found more than she expected." He unlocked the cabinet and quietly withdrew, leaving them alone with decades of carefully preserved records. Evelyn opened the first drawer. Hundreds of estate ledgers rested in perfect order, each labeled by year and noble house. Damian immediately noticed one section standing slightly uneven among the others. He reached toward a volume marked Ravenshire Accounts. Winter 1817. The leather binding cracked softly as he opened it. Columns of figures covered every page with mathematical precision. Rent collections. Agricultural profits. Land transfers. Nothing appeared unusual until Evelyn compared one ledger with another copy stored directly beneath it. The numbers did not match. She looked back and forth several times before speaking. Damian. He moved beside her. What is it? She pointed toward a single-line item. Estate Restoration Fund. £30,000. The identical entry appeared again in the second ledger, yet the amount had become 60,000. The date remained unchanged. The signatures matched perfectly. Only the money had doubled. Damian frowned. That should not be possible. Evelyn turned another page. More differences emerged. 5,000 became 15,000. 8,000 disappeared completely. Entire properties changed ownership between identical records. None of the alterations appeared careless. Every revision looked deliberate. Every signature looked authentic. Damian slowly lowered himself into the nearby chair. His breathing had grown quieter during the climb through the library, and Evelyn recognized the familiar exhaustion hidden beneath controlled posture. Without saying anything, she poured water from the crystal pitcher resting upon the reading table and handed him the glass. He accepted it with a grateful nod. Thank you. She remained beside him instead of returning to the documents. We are not racing anyone. A faint trace of dry humor appeared in his eyes. Someone might disagree. She almost smiled. Then let them wait. The moment lasted only seconds before the mystery reclaimed their attention. Damian reached for another ledger dated 1 year later. A folded sheet slipped free and landed gently upon the polished wood. It was not financial paperwork. It was a handwritten comparison prepared by Catherine herself. Her careful script listed page numbers beside short observations. Original ledger differs from parliamentary copy. Verify signatures with Harcourt Archive. Check Western Properties after Father's anniversary dinner. Do not discuss findings with Bernard Whitmore until evidence is complete. Evelyn felt the room become strangely still. Catherine had already discovered the discrepancies years earlier. She had been building her own investigation quietly while everyone believed she was arranging winter charities and social events. Damian touched the edge of the page with remarkable care. She trusted evidence more than suspicion. Evelyn looked toward him. And she trusted herself enough to keep looking. They searched for nearly an hour before discovering the final entry written across the bottom margin. If these records disappear, someone already knows I have seen them. A slow breath escaped Evelyn. She expected the documents to vanish. Damian nodded once. Which means she expected someone to follow her. Snow drifted softly against the tall windows while the library remained wrapped in timeless silence. Suddenly the caretaker returned carrying a narrow wooden case carved with a Harcourt crest. He placed it gently before Damian. Lady Harcourt asked that this remain sealed until the Duke visited in person. Damian looked surprised. She prepared this 12 years ago. The old man stepped back respectfully. Evelyn opened the lid. Inside rested several estate maps tied with blue ribbon and a small silver compass no larger than a pocket watch. Beneath them lay another envelope addressed simply to the next person who refuses to look away. Evelyn unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting belonged to Lady Harcourt herself. Catherine believed someone manipulated Ravenshire records through duplicate ledgers stored across private archives. She asked me to preserve every original copy because she feared official versions might one day become more convenient than truthful ones. If you are reading this, then she was wiser than I understood. Trust original ink before respectable men. Damian read the final sentence twice. His expression did not change, yet something inside his gaze became clearer. He no longer looked like a man searching desperately for answers. He looked like a man assembling pieces that had existed all along. Evelyn reached toward one of the estate maps and carefully unfolded it across the reading table. Colored markings covered the western land surrounding Ravenshire. Most boundaries appeared ordinary until she noticed 3 neighboring properties outlined in identical blue circles. She compared the names with Catherine's journal. Arthur Ellison. Charles Fenwick. Bernard Whitmore. The same 3 men appeared again. This time connected not by conversation but by land. Damian leaned forward slowly despite obvious fatigue. They surround Ravenshire. Evelyn followed the map with her fingertip. Every major access road passes through one of their estates. The caretaker quietly nodded from across the room. That arrangement did not exist when your father was alive, Your Grace. Damian looked toward him. When did it change? Shortly after Lady Catherine arrived at Ravenshire. Silence settled over the library once again. Outside, the pale winter sun slipped behind gathering clouds, and the room grew slightly darker. Evelyn carefully folded the map before returning it to the wooden case. As she lifted the final document resting beneath the ribbon, something small slid onto the table with a gentle metallic sound. It was another key. Smaller than the first and engraved with a single unfamiliar word. Archive East. Damian picked it up slowly while the caretaker's calm expression finally showed genuine surprise. That room has remained locked for nearly 40 years, the old man whispered. Evelyn looked toward the narrow key resting in Damian's hand, and for the first time since Catherine's journal had reopened the past, she realized they were no longer uncovering forgotten memories. They were following directions that someone had intentionally left behind, waiting for the one moment when a dying duke finally decided he intended to live. The smaller key remained inside Damian's coat pocket throughout the journey back to Ravenshire, yet Evelyn became increasingly convinced it carried far more weight than polished brass should have possessed. Twilight settled across the countryside in quiet shades of silver and blue while their carriage rolled through frozen fields bordered by ancient oaks standing motionless beneath fresh snow. Neither of them spoke for several miles. The silence no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to thought. Damian rested against the dark leather seat with his eyes closed, one hand still loosely holding Catherine's journal. The movement of the carriage seemed almost enough to lull him into sleep, but Evelyn noticed the faint tension around his jaw each time the road became uneven. He was tired in a way that reached beyond ordinary exhaustion. He had simply become too practiced at hiding it. She quietly unfolded the wool blanket stored beside her and draped it across his knees without saying a word. His eyes opened almost immediately. You are becoming impossible to surprise. She adjusted the edge of the blanket before meeting his gaze. You are becoming easier to understand. Something gentle appeared in his expression before fading into thoughtful silence. The carriage continued north through a world softened by winter until the towers of Ravenshire estate finally emerged beneath a pale evening sky. Hundreds of windows glowed warmly against the gathering darkness. Smoke drifted lazily from tall chimneys. For the first time since her arrival months earlier, Evelyn realized the estate no longer felt like a monument waiting for loss. It felt like a home slowly remembering how to hope. Mrs. Ellis greeted them in the entrance hall with unusual urgency. Your Grace, the physician visited while you were away. Damian removed his gloves calmly. Did he leave instructions? Only one. She hesitated before continuing. He requested complete rest for the next several days. Damian accepted his coat from a servant without visible reaction. Then I regret disappointing him already. Mrs. Ellis sighed almost affectionately. That was the response I expected. Evelyn glanced toward Damian as they climbed the grand staircase together. His pace remained steady, yet noticeably slower than it had been that morning. The long day had demanded more than his strength wished to admit. Halfway along the upper corridor, another quiet cough interrupted the silence. He stopped briefly beside one of the tall windows overlooking the snow-covered gardens until his breathing settled again. Evelyn waited without drawing attention to the moment. After a few seconds he straightened naturally. You do not have to pretend you did not notice. Her answer came softly. You do not have to pretend you are not tired. The honesty between them no longer felt dangerous. It simply existed. Damian looked toward the gardens where lanterns reflected against untouched snow. I spent years believing weakness invited disaster. Evelyn stood beside him. And what do you believe now? He considered the question longer than expected. Perhaps hiding weakness creates loneliness instead. The corridor remained perfectly still around them. Somewhere far below, servants prepared evening tea while old clocks quietly measured another ordinary hour inside an extraordinary house. Evelyn looked at the reflection appearing beside hers in the glass. "You have never been alone as much as you believed." Damian followed her gaze. "No." She shook her head gently. "You simply stopped letting anyone stand beside you." Neither of them spoke again for several moments. Snow drifted beyond the window in slow, graceful patterns that made the entire world appear suspended between breaths. Damian finally reached into his pocket and removed the smaller brass key recovered from West Harcourt Library. He placed it carefully into Evelyn's hand. "Keep it." She looked down in surprise. "Why?" "Because if I keep it, I will convince myself there is time to use it later." Evelyn closed her fingers around the cool metal. "And if I keep it?" A faint trace of dry humor returned to his voice. "You will remind me that later is an unreliable promise." They continued toward the private drawing room where a fire already burned beneath carved stone arches. Tea waited upon a small table beside two comfortable chairs placed unusually close together. Mrs. Ellis had either guessed their routine or quietly decided to improve it. Evelyn poured tea while Damian settled into one of the chairs with visible relief. The warmth of the room softened the lingering chill carried home from London. Catherine's journal rested between them beside the wooden case from Lady Harcourt. Neither reached for it immediately. Instead, Evelyn noticed a small stack of unopened correspondence waiting beside Damian's place. The top envelope carried the official blue seal of Parliament. He glanced at it only once before pushing it aside untouched. "You are not curious?" she asked. "Very." "Then why not read it?" He wrapped both hands around the warm teacup. "Because I spent too much of my life allowing other people to decide which thoughts deserved my attention first." Evelyn smiled quietly. "You are changing." He looked toward the fire. "It feels uncomfortable." Most healing does. The simple conversation seemed to ease something invisible between them. The silence that followed no longer carried grief or hesitation. It carried companionship. Outside, snow continued falling across Ravenshire while golden firelight reflected softly through the windows. Damian eventually reached toward the journal and carefully opened a page they had not examined before. A pressed winter camellia slipped onto the table. Folded beneath it rested a narrow strip of paper no wider than a ribbon. Catherine had written only one sentence. "The bravest people are rarely the loudest. They are the ones who quietly refuse to surrender ordinary kindness." Evelyn traced the elegant handwriting with thoughtful eyes. "She understood you." Damian stared at the words for a long moment. "No." She looked toward him. He gently lifted the fragile paper. "She understood the man I was trying to become." His voice remained calm, yet something unexpectedly vulnerable lived beneath every syllable. Evelyn reached across the small distance separating their chairs and without hesitation covered his hand with hers. Neither movement felt planned. Neither felt surprising anymore. Damian did not pull away. Instead, his fingers relaxed beneath hers as though years of invisible weight had finally become lighter by the smallest measure. The fire cracked softly between them. The old estate settled into evening quiet. Mrs. Ellis paused briefly outside the half-open door, noticed the peaceful silence inside, and continued down the corridor without disturbing it. Time seemed content to slow. At last Damian looked toward Evelyn with complete honesty. "I am afraid." She did not ask of what. She already knew. "I know. I am afraid that if I begin believing I might stay, losing that hope will hurt more than accepting the end." Evelyn considered him carefully before answering. "Hope is not a contract promising tomorrow." Her voice remained gentle but certain. "It is simply permission to live today." The words lingered in the room long after she finished speaking. Damian lowered his eyes briefly before giving the smallest nod she had ever seen from him. It carried more trust than speeches could have achieved. Then, without warning, a sharp cough interrupted the quiet evening. He instinctively turned away, pressing a white handkerchief against his lips until the moment passed. When he lowered it again, his breathing remained steady, but Evelyn noticed the faint crimson stain hidden against the folded linen. He followed her gaze and calmly folded the cloth closed before setting it beside the untouched parliamentary letter. The fire continued burning as though nothing had changed. Yet both of them understood that time remained precious. Evelyn quietly reached for the smaller brass key resting beside her teacup and closed her hand around it with renewed determination. Somewhere inside Ravenshire, beyond locked doors forgotten for 4 decades, waited Archive East. And for the first time since Catherine had begun leaving silent clues behind, the mystery no longer felt like a journey into the past. It felt like the only path leading toward Damian's future. The parliamentary summons arrived before sunrise, carried through falling snow by a messenger who appeared almost embarrassed to deliver it. Mrs. Ellis accepted the blue-sealed envelope with practiced composure, yet her expression changed the moment she recognized the official crest pressed into the wax. She found Damian and Evelyn exactly where she expected them to be, seated beside the library fire with ledgers, journals, and Catherine's notes spread across the long oak table. The quiet rhythm of investigation had already become part of every morning inside Ravenshire. She placed the letter gently beside Damian's untouched tea. "Your Grace, Parliament requests your presence in London this afternoon." Damian studied the envelope without reaching for it. "Requests?" Mrs. Ellis nodded carefully. "The wording is considerably more polite than the intention." Evelyn unfolded the document after he silently handed it to her. The elegant language concealed unmistakable pressure beneath layers of courtesy. The Parliamentary Estate Review Committee respectfully invites His Grace the Duke of Ravenshire to provide clarification regarding ongoing administrative concerns, succession stability, and long-term management planning. Evelyn lowered the page slowly. "They are expecting weakness." Damian looked toward the snow drifting beyond the tall windows. "Then disappointment will become their first lesson today." 2 hours later the Ravenshire carriage rolled into Westminster beneath a grey winter sky that made the stone buildings appear older than history itself. Government clerks hurried across the courtyard carrying stacks of documents while polished carriages lined the entrance in orderly rows. Every visitor seemed to know exactly where to stand. Every servant seemed trained never to look surprised. Yet when Damian Ashford stepped from the carriage beside Evelyn, conversations paused almost immediately. Several officials exchanged brief, uncertain glances before quickly pretending nothing unusual had happened. A young clerk approached with perfect manners. "Your Grace, the committee is already assembled." Damian adjusted his gloves calmly. "Then I regret making certainty uncomfortable." Evelyn walked beside him through endless corridors lined with portraits of former ministers and judges. The building carried its own kind of silence, one built from procedure instead of grief. Tall windows admitted pale winter light that reflected across polished marble floors. At the end of the central hallway heavy double doors stood open. Inside waited 12 committee members seated around an enormous circular table. Bernard Whitmore occupied one position near the center, his expression composed enough to suggest he had rehearsed every possible outcome except this one. Damian entered without hesitation. Evelyn remained beside him rather than behind him. Several observers immediately noticed the choice. Lord Pembroke, the committee chairman, rose politely. "Your Grace, we appreciate your willingness to attend despite recent medical speculation." Damian accepted the offered chair but remained standing. Speculation rarely improves through repetition. A few restrained smiles appeared around the room before disappearing beneath official seriousness. Pembroke cleared his throat. "Naturally. Our concern involves continuity rather than rumor." Evelyn quietly placed Catherine's journal and the duplicated ledgers upon the polished table. Several committee members glanced toward the unexpected documents. Bernard Whitmore watched without moving. Pembroke continued. "The committee wishes only to ensure that Ravenshire remains properly protected should unforeseen circumstances arise." Damian folded his hands calmly. "Ravenshire is currently protected. Future protection remains equally important. I am presently occupying the future you appear eager to discuss." The room became noticeably quieter. One elderly trustee adjusted his spectacles while another carefully avoided looking toward Bernard Whitmore. Pembroke attempted another approach. Your Grace, we merely seek responsible planning. Damian finally sat down, every movement controlled despite the fatigue hidden beneath his calm exterior. Responsible planning begins by asking whether a man is alive before redistributing what belongs to him. Evelyn noticed several committee members exchange thoughtful expressions. Bernard Whitmore spoke for the first time. His voice remained perfectly measured. No one questions your legal authority, Your Grace. The concern involves practical administration should illness limit active oversight. Damian looked directly at him. Then perhaps practical administration should begin by explaining why duplicate Ravenshire ledgers contain conflicting financial records. Silence arrived so quickly that even the ticking clock upon the wall seemed suddenly louder. Bernard's expression changed only slightly. I assume there is an explanation. Evelyn calmly opened one of the ledgers and placed it beside its matching copy. We agree. Her voice remained warm and composed. That is exactly why we brought them. Lord Pembroke leaned forward with visible interest while several trustees carefully compared the pages before them. Identical signatures. Different numbers. Identical dates. Different ownership records. One younger committee member quietly frowned. These cannot both be originals. Damian answered without raising his voice. That observation is the reason I accepted today's invitation. Bernard Whitmore rested one hand upon the table. Document copying errors occasionally occur? Evelyn gently unfolded Catherine's handwritten comparison notes and placed them beside the ledgers. Lady Catherine Ashford noticed the same discrepancies 12 years ago. Bernard looked toward the familiar handwriting for only a fraction of a second. It was enough. Damian noticed the reaction immediately. So did Evelyn. Lord Pembroke accepted the page and read silently. Interesting. He looked toward Bernard. Were these concerns ever presented to the committee? Bernard remained perfectly composed. Not to my knowledge. Evelyn reached into her reticule and removed the partial receipt recovered from Catherine's journal. Delivered personally to Bernard Whitmore. She placed it beside the other papers without accusation. Without drama. Simply allowing quiet evidence to exist. The atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. Several trustees now studied Bernard instead of Damian. The balance of attention had changed. Bernard finally offered a restrained smile. A receipt proves delivery, not significance. Damian nodded once. Agreed. He slowly removed the folded letter Catherine had written shortly before her death. That is why significance should never rely upon a single document. He handed it to Lord Pembroke, who read every line with increasing concentration. The chairman remained silent for nearly a minute before looking toward Bernard again. Did Lady Catherine ever discuss inheritance concerns with you? Bernard answered carefully. She occasionally asked ordinary estate questions. Did she express suspicion regarding duplicate records? Not directly. Pembroke placed the letter beside the journals. Curious. The word carried more weight than accusation. Snow pressed softly against the high windows while every person inside the committee chamber seemed unwilling to disturb the growing stillness. Evelyn glanced toward Damian. His posture remained steady, yet she recognized the familiar signs of increasing exhaustion. His breathing had become slightly slower. One hand rested almost imperceptibly against the edge of the chair as though conserving strength. Without interrupting the proceedings, she quietly slid a glass of water toward him beneath the table. He accepted it with the smallest grateful nod. The gesture escaped almost everyone except one elderly trustee seated near the window. Lady Margaret Ashcombe had served on estate review commissions for decades and rarely spoke unless necessary. She watched the exchange thoughtfully before addressing the room. I have known 3 Dukes of Ravenshire. Every conversation immediately stopped. The first built railways. The second built schools. The third appears to be rebuilding trust. Her gaze settled upon Damian. Continue. Damian looked toward her with genuine respect. Thank you. He reached into the leather portfolio resting beside his chair and withdrew one final document. It was the estate map recovered from West Harcourt Library showing 3 neighbouring properties surrounding Ravenshire, each connected to the same names appearing throughout Catherine's journals. Arthur Ellison, Charles Fenwick, Bernard Whitmore. He spread the map across the polished table. No accusation followed. Only silence and visible patterns. One trustee slowly removed his spectacles. Another leaned closer. Lord Pembroke traced the blue circles with his fingertip before lifting his eyes toward Bernard Whitmore. The older man remained perfectly calm, yet for the first time uncertainty appeared beneath his composed expression. Before anyone could speak, the chamber doors opened quietly. A uniformed clerk entered carrying another sealed envelope marked immediate witness submission. He approached Lord Pembroke and whispered only one sentence. The chairman's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He looked first toward Damian, then toward Bernard, before breaking the seal and unfolding the enclosed statement. The room waited in complete silence while snow continued falling beyond Parliament, covering London in white just as hidden truth slowly began emerging from beneath years of carefully arranged respectability. Lord Pembroke did not read the statement aloud immediately. Instead, he lowered the paper onto the polished table and studied the signature with unusual care, as though confirming that memory and ink still belonged to the same person. Every member of the committee remained perfectly still. Outside the tall windows, soft snow continued falling across Westminster, turning the city into a quiet landscape that seemed entirely unaware of the change unfolding inside its oldest chamber. Bernard Whitmore folded his hands with measured confidence, yet Evelyn noticed the slightest tightening at the corner of his jaw. It lasted less than a second. It was enough. Pembroke finally looked toward the uniformed clerk. "Is the witness present?" "Yes, my lord." "Escort her inside." A gentle murmur moved around the circular table before disappearing into silence once more. Damian remained composed beside Evelyn, though she recognized the familiar signs of fatigue hidden beneath his calm posture. His breathing had become slower during the long hearing. One hand rested lightly against the arm of the chair while the other remained near Catherine's journal as though quiet truth itself had become an anchor. The chamber doors opened again. An elderly woman entered with careful but steady steps, supported by a polished walnut cane. Her silver hair was gathered neatly beneath a dark blue bonnet, and her winter coat showed the quiet elegance of someone who had spent a lifetime valuing dignity over display. Evelyn recognized her immediately. Mrs. Abigail Turner had served as assistant archivist for Ravenshire during Damian's father's administration before retiring nearly 15 years earlier. Mrs. Turner bowed politely toward the committee before her eyes settled upon Damian. Something warm and unmistakably maternal softened her expression. "Your Grace." Damian stood despite Evelyn's almost imperceptible concern. "Mrs. Turner." The older woman smiled gently. "You have your mother's eyes when you decide not to surrender." A few committee members exchanged curious glances. Bernard Whitmore remained silent. Lord Pembroke gestured toward the empty chair prepared near the center of the room. "Mrs. Turner, you submitted this statement voluntarily." "I did." "And you understand its importance." "Better than most." She settled carefully into the chair before placing a small cloth-wrapped package upon the table. "I should have spoken years ago." The room seemed to grow quieter still. Pembroke unfolded the witness statement while Mrs. Turner slowly untied the faded ribbon securing the bundle. Inside rested several folded sheets, each marked with official Ravenshire seals dating back more than a decade. She touched the first document with remarkable care. Lady Catherine visited the archive every Tuesday afternoon during the winter before she became ill. Evelyn leaned slightly forward. Damian did not move at all. Mrs. Turner continued. She always asked for original ledgers instead of copied summaries. She said numbers deserved the same respect as promises. A faint trace of almost forgotten amusement touched Damian's expression. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. Pembroke looked down at the written statement. Did Lady Catherine express concern regarding the records? Yes. Mrs. Turner answered without hesitation. She believed duplicate ledgers existed. Bernard Whitmore finally spoke. His voice remained perfectly calm. Many estates maintain duplicate copies. Mrs. Turner turned toward him politely. Copies should not disagree with originals. No one interrupted her after that. She unfolded another page. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained clear. Catherine had copied several account entries by hand, comparing amounts from 2 separate archives. At the bottom she had written one sentence. If both books cannot be true, then someone profits from confusion. Evelyn felt her heart beat slow as another piece of the puzzle quietly settled into place. Lord Pembroke examined the page before passing it to Lady Margaret Ashcombe, who studied every line with visible concentration. Mrs. Turner reached into the cloth bundle once more. This time she withdrew a small envelope addressed in Catherine's unmistakable handwriting. She left this with me the final afternoon I saw her. Damian looked toward the envelope but did not reach for it. Mrs. Turner smiled sadly. She told me, if Damian ever starts blaming himself again, remind him that questions are not tragedies. Silence is. The word seemed to stop time itself. Damian lowered his eyes briefly. Evelyn did not speak. She simply remained beside him, close enough that quiet support required no explanation. Mrs. Turner continued in the same gentle voice. Lady Catherine did not fear illness nearly as much as she feared unfinished truth. Bernard Whitmore leaned forward slightly. Did she ever accuse anyone directly? No. Did she name any conspirators? No. Bernard nodded once. Then her observations remained speculation. Before anyone else could respond, Mrs. Turner reached beneath the final folded cloth and removed one narrow leather notebook no larger than a gentleman's wallet. She handed it directly to Lord Pembroke. This belonged to my late husband. He served as Ravenshire's senior records clerk. Pembroke carefully opened the notebook. Every page contained dates beside short entries recording requests for archived documents. Most appeared entirely ordinary until he reached the winter of Catherine's investigation. One name appeared again and again. Bernard Whitmore. Another name followed several weeks later. Lady Catherine Ashford. Then a final notation written in hurried script. Lady Catherine requested comparison access. Request delayed due to prior removal authorization. Evelyn quietly looked toward Damian. She was being prevented from seeing the originals. Damian nodded almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Turner folded her hands together. She returned the following week anyway. She thanked every servant by name. She left white camellias for the kitchen staff because she knew one maid had lost her daughter. Her smile trembled only slightly. She was the kind of lady who remembered ordinary sadness. The chamber remained silent long after she finished speaking. Even Bernard Whitmore offered no immediate reply. Lord Pembroke finally closed the notebook and looked around the committee. It appears Lady Catherine pursued administrative inconsistencies with remarkable persistence. Lady Margaret Ashcombe answered quietly. It also appears no one listened carefully enough. Snow drifted gently across the high windows while afternoon light faded into soft grey. Damian slowly reached toward Catherine's journal resting beside him. He opened to the final completed page and read the familiar sentence once more. The bravest people are rarely the loudest. They are the ones who quietly refuse to surrender ordinary kindness. He closed the journal again and looked toward Mrs. Turner. Thank you for remembering her correctly. The elderly woman smiled with unmistakable affection. Your Grace, she always believed one day you would stop preparing for endings and begin asking questions. A young parliamentary clerk hurried quietly into the chamber before anyone else could speak. His face carried the restrained urgency of someone trained never to panic. He bowed respectfully toward Lord Pembroke before presenting another sealed packet. This arrived from West Harcourt Library less than 10 minutes ago. Pembroke accepted it and broke the seal. A single sheet slipped into his hand along with a smaller folded note marked for the Duke of Ravenshire alone. Damian unfolded the private note first. Evelyn watched his expression carefully as his eyes moved across Catherine's familiar handwriting preserved by time. She had written only one sentence. If you find the Archive East key, do not go there alone. Someone already knows where the truth is waiting. The note remained in Damian's hand long after the parliamentary chamber emptied into quiet corridors lined with fading afternoon light. He read Catherine's final warning once more before carefully folding the paper and returning it to the inner pocket of his coat. Evelyn walked beside him without asking what he intended to do next. She already knew. The answer had been growing inside him since the first farewell letter disappeared into the Ravenshire fireplace. He was no longer searching for permission to live. He was simply learning how. Snow covered the stone steps outside Westminster, softening the sounds of departing carriages and distant church bells. Their driver opened the carriage door, expecting the familiar journey north, but Damian remained still for several moments while his eyes rested upon the pale winter sky. Evelyn quietly joined him beside the entrance instead of climbing inside. "You are thinking about Archive East?" He nodded once. "Yes. And you are wondering whether Catherine wanted to protect you or guide you?" A faint breath escaped him. "Perhaps both." The carriage rolled through London as twilight slowly settled across the city. Gas lamps awakened one by one, casting warm circles of light over frozen streets while elegant townhouses reflected gold against untouched snow. For the first time since their marriage, neither Damian nor Evelyn opened a ledger, examined a journal, or discussed evidence during the journey. Silence became something gentler than investigation. It became companionship. Damian leaned his head lightly against the carriage window, watching blurred lights drift across the glass. His complexion remained pale beneath the fading daylight, and exhaustion rested openly upon his features now that formal duty had ended. Evelyn noticed his eyes closing briefly every few minutes before quietly opening again through habit rather than necessity. She reached toward the wool blanket folded beside her and spread it across his shoulders. He looked toward her with quiet surprise. "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Taking care of things before I ask." She adjusted the edge of the blanket with calm precision. "You spent years taking responsibility for everyone else." Her voice remained soft. "Allow someone else a turn." He looked at her for a long moment before lowering his eyes toward his hands. "I'm not very good at accepting help." Evelyn smiled gently. "I noticed." Something unexpectedly warm passed between them. No dramatic confession interrupted the quiet space. No carefully rehearsed declaration appeared. Only trust, arriving so gradually that neither of them realized how much had already changed. Ravenshire welcomed them beneath a sky filled with slow-falling snow. Lanterns illuminated the long driveway while servants waited beneath the entrance portico with hot tea and thick winter cloaks. Mrs. Ellis met them at the door carrying her usual calm expression, yet relief appeared the moment she saw Damian walking steadily beside Evelyn. "The entire household has been waiting." Damian removed his gloves. "For parliamentary news." Mrs. Ellis shook her head. "For you to return home." The simple answer left the great hall unexpectedly quiet. Damian glanced toward the familiar staircase, the portraits lining the walls, and the staff pretending not to watch him too closely. For years he had believed Ravenshire existed only as responsibility. Now it quietly revealed itself as belonging. Later that evening the fire burned brightly inside the private drawing room while snow tapped gently against the tall windows overlooking silent gardens. Catherine's journal rested closed upon the table. The Archive East key lay beside it, reflecting golden light. Evelyn poured fresh tea before noticing Damian studying the flames with unusual concentration. "You are somewhere else." He answered honestly. "I am remembering." "Something painful." He slowly shook his head. "Something ordinary." She waited. Catherine used to insist that every difficult conversation happened beside a fire because she believed people told the truth more easily when they were warm. Evelyn looked toward the flames. "She sounds wise." She was. Silence followed, but it no longer carried grief alone. Memory had begun changing shape inside him. It no longer arrived only as loss. It had started becoming gratitude. Mrs. Ellis quietly entered carrying a tray of evening biscuits before pausing beside the table. Her eye settled upon the small brass key. "I have seen that before." Damian immediately looked up. "Where?" She placed the tray down carefully. "Many years ago. Your father kept a matching key inside his study." Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "A matching key?" Mrs. Ellis nodded. "He called Archive East the safest room in Ravenshire because truth could not easily be misplaced there." Damian stood almost instinctively. "Does the room still exist?" "Yes." "Why has no one mentioned it?" Mrs. Ellis offered a gentle smile touched with regret. "Because no one has entered it since the winter your father passed away." The old house settled around them with familiar creaks carried through stone corridors built generations earlier. Somewhere above, the great clock announced the hour. Snow continued falling beyond every window. Damian picked up the brass key, turning it slowly between his fingers. "Tomorrow morning." Evelyn looked toward him. "We open it together." He met her eyes. Catherine warned against going alone. "Then don't." The answer came so naturally that both of them fell briefly silent afterward. Mrs. Ellis quietly excused herself, leaving only the fire and the steady rhythm of winter evening surrounding them. Damian remained standing beside the mantel while Evelyn gathered the journals into careful stacks. As she reached for the final volume, a folded page slipped free and drifted onto the carpet. She picked it up without thinking. It was not part of Catherine's handwriting. The ink appeared darker and more recent. Only a single sentence had been written across the center of the page in precise, unfamiliar script. "Some doors remain locked because they protect the people outside them." Evelyn read the words twice before handing the note to Damian. He studied the handwriting carefully, then looked toward the closed library doors. This was not here before. A quiet uneasiness settled over the room. No window stood open. No servant had entered unnoticed. Yet the note rested among Catherine's journals as though someone had quietly placed it there while the house welcomed its master home. Evelyn stepped closer until only inches separated them. Without hesitation, Damian reached for her hand. His fingers closed around hers with steady warmth, not seeking reassurance but sharing resolve. The fire continued burning peacefully, throwing gentle light across ancient walls and forgotten secrets. Outside, Ravenshire slept beneath fresh snow. Somewhere deep within the estate, behind a door untouched for 40 years, Archive East waited in complete silence, and for the first time the mystery no longer felt as though it belonged only to Catherine's past. It was already reaching toward Damian and Evelyn's future. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of quiet steel, and Ravenshire estate seemed to hold its breath with the rest of the countryside. Snow rested upon every stone ledge and cedar branch, smoothing the familiar landscape into gentle silence. Evelyn stood alone in the eastern gallery before sunrise, watching pale light slowly climb across the frozen gardens while the small brass key remained hidden inside her gloved hand. She had barely slept. Not because of fear, but because hope carried its own restless weight. Behind her, the long corridor remained empty until slow footsteps echoed across polished floors. Damian approached without hurry, dressed in a dark wool coat that made the winter light emphasize the tiredness he could no longer completely disguise. Yet his eyes held something new. Purpose had become stronger than resignation. He stopped beside her and looked toward the untouched snow. "Everything appears peaceful." Evelyn answered softly. "The most important things usually happen before anyone notices." He almost smiled. "You have become dangerously optimistic." She finally looked toward him. "You have become dangerously willing to listen." Mrs. Ellis joined them moments later carrying an old lantern instead of allowing servants to accompany them. "The entrance to Archive East is beneath the original west staircase," she explained quietly. "Your father believed forgotten history deserved dignity rather than dust." The three of them walked through corridors that had not welcomed morning visitors in decades. Portraits of long-departed dukes watched silently from paneled walls while ancient clocks measured each passing second with patient certainty. At the end of a narrow passage, Mrs. Ellis stopped before an oak door hidden almost perfectly behind carved shelves filled with estate records. A small brass lock waited beneath layers of age. Evelyn removed the key from her glove and placed it into Damian's hand. "You should open it." He looked down at the worn metal for several moments. "No." She frowned gently. "Why?" He closed her fingers back around the key. "Because I spent too many years believing every burden belonged to me alone." The quiet answer settled deeply between them. Without another word, Evelyn inserted the key into the lock. It turned with surprising ease. The heavy door opened inward almost silently. A cool breath of untouched air drifted into the corridor, carrying the faint scent of cedar wood and old paper. Lantern light revealed rows of carefully preserved cabinets stretching into the shadows. Nothing appeared abandoned. Everything waited exactly where someone had intended it to remain. Shelves held ledgers tied with blue ribbons. Maps rested inside polished drawers. Wooden boxes carried handwritten labels dated nearly 50 years earlier. Mrs. Ellis slowly removed her gloves. His Grace's father visited every winter. Damian walked into the room with remarkable stillness. "I never knew. He wished you to inherit certainty instead of suspicion." Evelyn noticed a large writing desk positioned beneath a tall arched window overlooking the eastern gardens. Unlike every other surface, the desk remained completely clean except for one sealed envelope and a single white camellia preserved beneath glass. The envelope bore no name. Only one sentence written across the front. "Open only when Ravenshire remembers courage." Damian reached toward it but paused before touching the paper. Evelyn quietly stepped beside him. "You do not have to carry every memory alone." He looked toward her and finally nodded. Together they opened the seal. Inside rested several pages written in his father's unmistakable hand. "My son, if these words ever reach you, then I have already failed to tell you something while I was alive. Estates survive because people trust records. Families survive because people trust each other. If one must be sacrificed, always protect the second." Damian continued reading while silence wrapped gently around the forgotten room. "Your mother believed truth should never be hidden forever. Catherine believed the same. If both women agree on anything, I recommend listening to them even after I am gone." Evelyn glanced toward Damian and saw the smallest trace of emotion soften his guarded expression. His father had not left instructions for power. He had left permission for humanity. Mrs. Ellis quietly opened one of the nearby cabinets. Inside rested dozens of estate maps preserved in perfect order. Evelyn moved beside her and immediately noticed one narrow compartment hidden behind the larger drawers. She carefully slid it open. A leather portfolio appeared, far thinner than expected. The cover carried Catherine's initials embossed in silver. Damian joined her without speaking. The portfolio contained only 3 items. A detailed survey of Ravenshire's western boundary. A list of parliamentary trustees. And a letter Catherine had never mailed. Evelyn unfolded it carefully. "Damian, if I am wrong, burn this and laugh at my imagination. If I am right, promise me something instead. Do not spend your life apologizing for surviving. Someone has convinced you that existing is selfish. They are mistaken. You belong here as much as anyone." The words blurred for a moment as quiet emotion filled the room. Damian accepted the letter with steady hands, reading each line as though hearing Catherine's voice across time. He stood completely still until Evelyn gently touched his sleeve. "She knew you." His answer came almost as a whisper. "Better than I knew myself." Suddenly a faint sound echoed somewhere beyond the archive walls. Not danger. Not violence. Simply the unmistakable scrape of a cabinet door slowly closing in another room. Mrs. Ellis looked toward the narrow hallway connecting the storage chambers. "I thought we were alone." Damian folded Catherine's letter and placed it carefully inside his coat. "Perhaps we are not." The 3 of them followed the sound through rows of forgotten records until they reached a smaller chamber illuminated only by pale winter light filtering through a high window. Nothing appeared disturbed except one open cabinet standing against the far wall. Its drawers remained neatly organized. Its shelves perfectly clean. Yet one space stood empty, outlined by years of undisturbed dust. Evelyn looked closer and noticed a handwritten label attached beneath the vacant section. Parliamentary Transfer Authorization Originals. She slowly turned toward Damian. Something was stored here. Mrs. Ellis stepped forward, her expression growing unexpectedly thoughtful. No. She pointed toward the dustless rectangle. Something was stored here yesterday. Silence settled across Archive East. Snow drifted gently outside while morning light spread across ancient wood and forgotten promises. Damian rested one hand upon the edge of the empty shelf without speaking. He no longer looked like the man who once prepared farewell letters beside the library fire. He looked like a duke watching pieces of his family's history quietly disappear in real time. Evelyn reached into the empty space and her fingers brushed against a tiny folded scrap of paper left behind almost invisibly against the polished wood. She unfolded it with careful hands. Only 7 words appeared in precise familiar handwriting. You are finally asking the right questions. No signature followed, yet all 3 of them recognized the elegant script immediately. It belonged to Bernard Whitmore. The note rested quietly in Evelyn's hand, yet its 7 simple words seemed to echo through every silent corridor of Archive East long after no one spoke. Mrs. Ellis looked toward the empty cabinet again as though years of loyal service might somehow explain what ordinary logic could not. Damian accepted the folded paper from Evelyn and examined Bernard Whitmore's unmistakably elegant handwriting without visible anger. Instead, an unexpected calm settled across his features. He carefully slipped the note beside Catherine's letters and closed the leather portfolio. He wanted us to find it. Evelyn frowned slightly. Why would anyone leave evidence on purpose? Damian slowly looked around the forgotten archive. Because confidence sometimes becomes louder than caution. Snow continued falling beyond the high windows while pale morning light reflected across rows of untouched ledgers. The old room felt less like a hidden chamber now and more like a conversation waiting decades for someone willing to listen. Mrs. Ellis quietly opened another cabinet and removed a bundle of rolled estate maps tied with faded blue ribbon. These belong to your father, she explained. He reviewed them every January without exception. Evelyn helped her spread the largest map across the writing table. The parchment covered nearly the entire surface, showing Ravenshire and every neighboring estate with remarkable precision. Colored markings appeared along roads, bridges, mills, and boundary lines. Most remained ordinary until Evelyn noticed several tiny circles drawn in pale blue ink connecting properties owned by Bernard Whitmore, Arthur Ellison, and Charles Fenwick. Damian leaned forward slowly. Those circles were not added by my father. Mrs. Ellis adjusted her spectacles. No. Her voice softened. They belonged to Lady Catherine. Evelyn followed the markings until they converged upon one location near the Eastern River crossing. An old customs office abandoned years earlier after new trade routes opened farther south. Catherine had written only 2 words beside the building. Compare copies. Damian reached toward the margin where another faint notation almost disappeared beneath age. Original transfers stored separately after committee revision. Evelyn exchanged a thoughtful glance with him. She believed duplicate records existed outside Parliament. Before Damian could answer, a servant appeared quietly at the archive entrance carrying a silver tray with fresh correspondence. The young footman hesitated before stepping inside. Your Grace, this arrived by express carriage from London. Damian accepted the envelope. The seal belonged to Lady Margaret Ashcombe. He opened it immediately. The letter inside contained only a few carefully written lines. Parliament has agreed to suspend all administrative recommendations until independent verification of the Ravenshire ledgers is completed. Trust evidence. Trust fewer people. Bring the Duchess to every meeting. Damian looked toward Evelyn before the smallest genuine smile touched his face. Lady Margaret appears very direct. Evelyn accepted the letter. I believe I like her already. Mrs. Ellis quietly excused herself to organize the recovered records, leaving the Duke and Duchess alone inside the silent archive. For several moments neither of them returned to the documents. They simply stood beside the wide window overlooking snow-covered gardens where ancient cedar trees carried white branches beneath a clear winter sky. Damian rested one hand upon the stone windowsill. I spent so much time believing my responsibility was protecting Ravenshire. Evelyn stood beside him. It is. He slowly shook his head. No. I finally understand something different. She waited. Ravenshire has been protecting me all along. The quiet honesty of the admission filled the room more completely than any dramatic confession could have managed. Evelyn looked toward the estate stretching beyond the glass. Every servant, every gardener, every steward, every housekeeper had continued believing in a future Damian himself had nearly abandoned. She reached for his hand naturally, without hesitation or ceremony. This time he did not merely accept the gesture. His fingers gently intertwined with hers as though quiet trust had become instinct instead of effort. "You are different," she whispered. He watched snow drift across the gardens. "I know. Does it frighten you?" His answer arrived after thoughtful silence. "Less every day." They remained there until distant church bells carried across the valley, reminding them that ordinary life continued beyond archives and mysteries. Afternoon light slowly replaced the pale morning glow, warming the ancient room with soft gold. Evelyn returned to Catherine's portfolio and carefully examined the remaining pages. Between two estate surveys she discovered a folded sheet so thin it had nearly escaped notice. It contained no financial records. Instead it listed names. Kitchen staff. Stable boys. Gardeners. Laundry maids. Beside each Catherine had written short observations. Mrs. Green worries about her son's schooling. Thomas pretends not to limp. Sarah always saves the last biscuit for the youngest maid. Evelyn smiled gently while reading. Damian stepped closer. "What is it?" She handed him the page. He looked across the familiar names, many of whom still served Ravenshire after more than a decade. Catherine had remembered every ordinary person surrounding her. No title. No wealth. No influence. Only kindness carefully noticed and quietly preserved. Damian lowered the page with visible emotion. "I thought leadership meant carrying everything alone." Evelyn looked toward him. "Perhaps leadership is remembering that no one else should." Their conversation ended as Mrs. Ellis returned carrying another small cedar box discovered behind the archive shelves. Unlike the others, this one bore no crest or label. Only a simple brass latch polished by frequent use long ago. Damian opened it carefully. Inside rested a collection of letters tied together with white ribbon. None had ever been mailed. Every envelope carried his name written in Catherine's elegant hand. Evelyn looked toward him. "You should read them privately." Damian remained silent for several seconds before gently placing the bundle back inside the box. "No." She appeared surprised. He met her eyes with quiet certainty. The man who hid every difficult thought no longer exists. His voice remained calm. "If these letters still matter, then they belong to the life we are building, not the life I almost abandoned." Evelyn felt unexpected warmth rise behind her composed expression. She nodded once. Together they untied the ribbon and opened the first unfinished letter. Catherine had written only a few paragraphs before stopping. "Damian, if you ever read this, it means I was unable to convince you while standing beside you. So I will try one final time. The world becomes smaller every day you believe you deserve less of it. Please promise me that one day you will laugh without apologizing for surviving." The room became perfectly still. Damian read the final sentence twice before carefully folding the page. He did not speak. He simply looked toward the snow-covered gardens where sunlight now reflected brilliantly across untouched white fields. Evelyn watched him quietly until he turned toward her. There was no dramatic declaration, no theatrical moment worthy of ballroom applause. Only a man who had spent years preparing for absence finally allowing himself the smallest possibility of tomorrow. Outside, a raven landed upon the stone fountain before lifting into the bright winter sky, and somewhere deep within Ravenshire the old house settled gently around the people who had finally begun giving it exactly what Catherine had hoped for all along. Not perfect certainty, but the quiet courage to keep living. The physician arrived without announcement just as the afternoon sun began slipping behind the snow-covered hills surrounding Ravenshire. He had served the Ashford family for nearly 30 years and never hurried through the great entrance hall, yet today his pace carried unusual purpose. Mrs. Ellis greeted him with quiet understanding before leading him toward the Eastern Library where Damian and Evelyn remained surrounded by estate maps, Catherine's journals, and carefully organized ledgers. The fire burned steadily while pale winter light rested across the polished floor. Damian looked up as the physician entered, offering the familiar calm expression that had long convinced everyone he was stronger than he truly felt. The older man removed his glove slowly. "Your Grace, I would appreciate a few moments." Damian closed Catherine's latest letter and nodded. "Of course." Evelyn instinctively stood to leave, but the physician gently stopped her. "Your Grace, I believe you should remain." Silence settled over the room as snow drifted beyond the tall windows. The physician examined Damian with practiced attention before resting one hand upon his wrist. He listened to his breathing. He asked ordinary questions that somehow carried extraordinary weight. "Have you been sleeping? Have you been eating? Have you remembered to rest?" Damian answered honestly for perhaps the first time in years. "Somewhat." The physician smiled faintly. "That is already an improvement." After several quiet minutes he stepped back and removed his spectacles. Evelyn watched his expression carefully, expecting concern, perhaps another warning to avoid exertion or difficult travel. Instead the older gentleman looked directly at Damian with unmistakable surprise. "Something has changed." Damian folded his hands calmly. "I am aware of that." The physician slowly shook his head. "No. I mean physically." The room became perfectly still. "Your pulse is steadier than it has been in over a year. Your breathing remains strained but more consistent. Even the persistent weakness appears less severe." Damian stared at him without speaking. The physician continued with gentle certainty. "I cannot explain everything. Winter remains demanding. Fatigue remains real. You must still exercise caution." He paused before allowing the smallest smile to appear. "But I no longer believe you are a man preparing for immediate farewell." Evelyn felt warmth spread quietly through her chest. Damian simply looked toward the fire, absorbing words he had stopped expecting to hear. The physician gathered his instruments before adding one final observation. "Sometimes the body follows the direction the mind finally chooses." After he departed, neither Damian nor Evelyn spoke immediately. The library seemed larger somehow, filled with quiet possibility instead of careful endings. Mrs. Ellis entered carrying fresh tea and noticed the unusual silence. She looked from one face to the other. "Should I be worried?" Damian slowly stood and accepted the teacup she offered. For the first time in a very long while, no. Mrs. Ellis blinked once before quietly smiling to herself. Evening settled gently across Ravenshire while servants lit lanterns throughout the estate. The investigation resumed after supper, though its atmosphere had changed in ways neither Damian nor Evelyn could fully describe. Catherine's letters no longer felt like farewells. They felt like conversations continuing across time. Evelyn carefully unfolded another estate survey recovered from Archive East and immediately noticed a sequence of handwritten numbers hidden along the lower margin. They did not resemble financial records. They resembled shelf references. Damian joined her beside the table. "Those correspond to archive cabinets." She followed the pattern across the map. "Not here." Her finger stopped upon a notation written beside the old Eastern Customs Office Catherine had marked weeks earlier. "There." Mrs. Ellis adjusted the lantern closer. "The Customs Office closed decades ago." Damian examined the survey carefully. "Which makes it an excellent place to forget something important." Before anyone could continue, another carriage arrived outside the estate. Its wheels echoed softly across frozen stone while the front doors opened to admit Lady Margaret Ashcombe wrapped in a dark wool travelling cloak dusted with snow. She entered without ceremony, carrying a leather portfolio secured by blue ribbon. "Forgive the hour," she said warmly. "Truth rarely consults clocks." Damian welcomed her into the library while Evelyn accepted the portfolio. Lady Margaret removed her gloves and looked around the room with thoughtful approval. "Your home feels different." Damian almost smiled. "I have been informed the same is true of its owner." The older woman nodded as though confirming a private conclusion. She opened the portfolio and withdrew several authenticated parliamentary copies recently recovered from committee storage. Every document contained official seals verifying property transfers involving Ravenshire and neighbouring estates. Evelyn spread them beside Catherine's originals. The differences appeared immediately. One version transferred temporary oversight authority for Western roads. The other permanently reassigned revenue collection. Lord Pembroke had already signed an order requesting independent review. Lady Margaret quietly tapped the second page. Someone altered administrative language while preserving every signature. Damian studied the text carefully. Then Catherine was correct. Entirely. Lady Margaret reached into the portfolio once more and removed a sealed testimony from Arthur Ellison, one of the three names appearing repeatedly throughout Catherine's journals. The elderly landowner had submitted a voluntary statement before retiring from public affairs. Evelyn unfolded the pages and read aloud. "Lady Catherine visited my estate asking questions about duplicate ledgers. I informed her that Bernard Whitmore always insisted revised copy simplified parliamentary review. She thanked me and remarked that simplification often hides the most interesting details." Mrs. Ellis quietly closed her eyes for a brief moment. "That sounds exactly like her." Lady Margaret nodded. Mr. Ellison also confirmed something else. She produced a faded visitor log from the old customs office. Damian leaned closer despite visible fatigue. The log recorded only a handful of names over several winters. Bernard Whitmore, Charles Fenwick, Arthur Ellison, and unexpectedly, Damian's father. The final entry stopped every conversation. Lady Catherine Ashford. 1 week later the building permanently closed. Evelyn slowly lowered the page. She found something there. Lady Margaret answered softly. "I believe so." Snow continued falling outside while firelight danced across ancient shelves and forgotten journals. Damian rested one hand against the edge of the table, studying the overlapping evidence until individual clues slowly became a single pattern. Duplicate ledgers. Altered transfers. Hidden archives. Preserved originals. Catherine had never pursued isolated mysteries. She had followed one continuous thread stretching across years. He looked toward Evelyn. "Tomorrow we visit the customs office." She met his gaze without hesitation. "Together." Lady Margaret smiled quietly before returning the documents to the portfolio. "Good. Because Parliament has already reached the same conclusion." She unfolded one final letter bearing Lord Pembroke's signature. An official review party would arrive at Ravenshire in 48 hours to compare every recovered record with the originals. Bernard Whitmore had been formally requested to attend. No accusation had been issued. No judgment had been declared. Only evidence would speak. Damian accepted the letter and folded it carefully beside Catherine's notes. The fire cracked softly while winter winds whispered beyond the windows. He no longer looked like a man waiting for history to decide his future. He looked like the Duke of Ravenshire preparing to stand beside the people who had believed in him long before he learned to believe in himself. Outside, a single white camellia rested beneath fresh snow near the eastern garden wall, untouched and quietly enduring, exactly as Catherine had always hoped the truth would remain until someone finally came looking for it. Dawn covered the eastern road with untouched snow as the Ravenshire carriage approached the abandoned customs office that had quietly waited through decades of forgotten winters. Frost clung to the old stone walls, softening every sharp edge until the neglected building appeared almost peaceful beneath the pale grey sky. Yet Evelyn felt the quiet tension surrounding the place the moment she stepped onto the frozen ground. It was the kind of silence created when too many important conversations had ended without witnesses. Damian stood beside her wrapped in a heavy black coat, one gloved hand resting lightly against his walking cane more from habit than necessity. The physician's cautious optimism had returned color to his face, but the long months of illness still lingered in moments of exhaustion that arrived without warning. Mrs. Ellis remained close behind carrying Catherine's journals while Lady Margaret Ashcombe and Lord Pembroke arrived in a second carriage accompanied by two parliamentary archivists whose responsibility was documentation rather than authority. No guards surrounded the gathering. No accusations had yet become official. Only records would speak today. The caretaker unlocked the weathered front door with a rusted iron key that protested softly before yielding to time. Cold air drifted through narrow hallways lined with empty shelves and faded shipping ledgers. Dust rested peacefully upon every surface except one long oak table positioned beneath a cracked skylight. Someone had cleaned it recently. Evelyn noticed immediately. So did Damian. Lord Pembroke slowly removed his gloves and looked around the quiet room. Interesting. Lady Margaret touched the polished edge of the table. Very interesting. One parliamentary archivist carefully unpacked measuring tools, catalogue books, and sealed evidence envelopes while the second compared every recovered ledger against Catherine's handwritten notes. Evelyn moved toward the eastern wall where an old map cabinet remained built into the stone. Most drawers resisted movement until she discovered one that opened with surprising ease. Inside rested only a narrow cedar box tied with a white ribbon. No dust covered its surface. Damian quietly joined her. The ribbon carried a familiar knot. Catherine had always tied letters exactly the same way. He untied it carefully. Inside lay 3 original transfer authorizations bearing authentic parliamentary seals beside handwritten annotations from his father. Every alteration Catherine had suspected appeared documented with precise dates and corresponding originals. Lord Pembroke accepted the documents one by one, comparing signatures against certified parliamentary copies brought from Westminster. His expression remained controlled until the final page. Then he slowly removed his spectacles. These records were revised after official approval. Lady Margaret looked toward him. Without committee authorization. Without committee knowledge. The room fell completely silent. Bernard Whitmore arrived less than 10 minutes later. Snow rested lightly across his dark overcoat, and his composed expression remained unchanged despite the unexpected gathering already waiting inside. He bowed politely toward Lord Pembroke before acknowledging Damian and Evelyn with measured calm. "Your Grace." "Your Grace." Damian returned the greeting with equal courtesy. "Mr. Whitmore." No hostility entered the exchange. Only distance. Lord Pembroke invited Bernard to examine the original documents resting upon the table. The older gentleman read every page with remarkable composure before placing them back exactly where he had found them. "Authentic records," he observed quietly. "Indeed," Pembroke answered. Bernard looked toward Damian. "I imagine this answers many unfortunate questions." Damian met his gaze steadily. "It begins answering them." Evelyn watched both men carefully. Bernard did not resemble someone cornered by evidence. He resembled someone measuring the direction of an unavoidable tide. Lady Margaret unfolded Arthur Ellison's testimony beside Catherine's journals and the recovered transfer authorizations. The patterns aligned with quiet certainty. Duplicate ledgers. Revised wording. Preserved originals hidden outside parliamentary storage. Years of administrative convenience built upon unnoticed changes. Bernard studied the arrangement for several moments before speaking. Lady Catherine asked difficult questions. Mrs. Ellis answered softly from across the room. Because she cared about Ravenshire. Bernard nodded once. She cared about accuracy. Damian remained completely still. Did you know she suspected duplicate records? Bernard looked toward the frosted windows where snow continued drifting gently through the winter morning. Yes. The single word settled across the room with surprising weight. Lord Pembroke folded his hands. Why was nothing reported? Bernard sighed almost imperceptibly. Because at first the revisions appeared harmless. Temporary language simplified estate administration during periods of uncertainty. One change justified another. Eventually no one remembered where convenience ended and responsibility began. Lady Margaret regarded him thoughtfully. So the system continued correcting itself until it no longer resembled the truth. Bernard accepted the observation without argument. Evelyn carefully opened Catherine's final notebook and discovered one page they had never examined closely. A pressed white camellia rested beside a sentence written in elegant blue ink. Good people rarely wake intending to make dishonest choices. They simply become accustomed to small compromises until honesty feels inconvenient. She quietly handed the notebook to Damian. He read the line twice before passing it to Lord Pembroke. The chairman closed the journal gently. Lady Catherine possessed remarkable clarity. Bernard lowered his eyes toward the familiar handwriting. For the first time since Evelyn had met him, something resembling regret softened his composed features. She did. No dramatic confession followed. No raised voices disturbed the old customs office. Only quiet recognition that years of unnoticed decisions had slowly drifted away from principle until one thoughtful woman refused to stop asking questions. The parliamentary archivists completed their comparisons shortly before noon. Every recovered original matched Catherine's notes. Every revision appeared documented through duplicate copies rather than fraudulent signatures. Lord Pembroke carefully sealed the originals inside official evidence cases. The committee will restore the authentic records immediately, he announced. Independent review of every associated estate will begin at once. Lady Margaret smiled gently toward Damian. Ravenshire will no longer stand alone. Snowlight brightened through the cracked skylight, filling the old room with unexpected warmth. Evelyn looked toward Damian and noticed the quiet relief settling across his shoulders. The burden he had carried for years no longer belonged to one exhausted man. It had become shared responsibility, supported by truth instead of fear. As the gathering prepared to leave, the elderly caretaker approached carrying a final forgotten ledger discovered behind a loose stone beneath the map cabinet. He handed it directly to Damian. This was hidden separately. Damian opened the worn volume and found not financial accounts but personal notes written by his father over many winters. The final entry stopped him completely. If my son ever reads these pages, I hope he understands that leadership is not measured by how much pain a person carries in silence. It is measured by the courage to trust those willing to carry hope beside him. Damian closed the ledger slowly while winter sunlight reflected across untouched snow outside the old windows. Evelyn stepped beside him without speaking. Their hands found each other naturally, no longer uncertain, no longer restrained by careful distance. Lord Pembroke watched the quiet gesture before turning toward Lady Margaret with a knowing expression. "The records have been restored," he murmured. Lady Margaret looked toward the Duke and Duchess standing together beneath the pale winter light. "So has something far more valuable." As the carriages departed the abandoned customs office, no mystery remained hidden beneath forgotten ledgers or sealed archives. The truth had survived because ordinary kindness, patient memory, and quiet courage had refused to disappear, and Ravenshire rolled home through falling snow carrying not the weight of unfinished endings but the unmistakable promise of a future finally allowed to begin. The first sound that greeted spring at Ravenshire was not the call of birds returning across the valley or the gentle rush of water freed from winter ice. It was laughter. A young kitchen maid had dropped an entire basket of fresh apples upon the front path, and 3 gardeners abandoned every trace of dignity to chase the rolling fruit across the courtyard while Mrs. Ellis stood upon the stone steps pretending not to smile. Evelyn watched the scene from the library window with quiet delight. Only a few months earlier the estate had carried the solemn stillness of a house preparing to say goodbye. Now ordinary mistakes somehow felt like celebrations. She closed the last of Catherine's journals and carefully placed a pressed white camellia between its pages before returning it to the polished cedar box that would remain inside Archive East, preserved not as evidence but as family history. Behind her the library door opened softly. Damian entered carrying 2 cups of tea instead of a stack of ledgers. The simple change would once have seemed impossible. He crossed the room with steady steps that no longer paused every few moments from exhaustion. The physician still insisted upon moderation, proper meals, and generous rest, and Mrs. Ellis enforced those instructions with greater authority than any Parliament committee could hope to possess. Damian handed 1 cup to Evelyn before looking toward the sunlit gardens. The roses survived the winter. She followed his gaze. Tiny green leaves had begun appearing along carefully trimmed branches beside the eastern walk where snow had only recently disappeared. "So did you?" He looked down for a moment before answering with quiet honesty. "I almost did not." Evelyn reached toward his sleeve, smoothing an imaginary crease that did not need correcting. Almost is no longer part of the story. Warm afternoon light filled the library while servants opened tall windows to welcome fresh air carrying the scent of damp earth and early blossoms. Across the estate, ordinary work continued with peaceful confidence. Stable hands repaired fences damaged by snow. Children from the nearby village carried books toward the small school Damian's father had once built and nearly forgotten. Gardeners planted rows of white camellias beside the eastern wall in quiet memory of the woman whose patient questions had changed more lives than she could ever have imagined. Parliament's official review concluded 1 week later beneath the vaulted ceilings of Westminster. Lord Pembroke presented the restored Ravenshire records before the committee with measured dignity while Lady Margaret Ashcombe quietly observed every reaction in the room. The independent findings confirmed what Catherine's journals had revealed years earlier. Administrative revisions had gradually replaced original language through convenience rather than conspiracy, allowing confusion to become tradition until no one remembered where the first compromise had begun. Every authentic record recovered from Archive East and the abandoned Customs Office would now replace the altered copies. Bernard Whitmore stood when invited to address the committee. He did not defend himself with speeches or excuses. Instead, he accepted responsibility for choosing efficiency when diligence required greater patience. His resignation from parliamentary estate administration was accepted without public humiliation. Lord Pembroke later remarked that the restoration of truth mattered more than the destruction of reputations. Lady Margaret quietly replied that the best justice often allowed wisdom to replace pride. News travelled quickly across London society. Ballrooms that once whispered about the dying Duke of Ravenshire now spoke with unexpected admiration about the quiet investigation that had preserved one of England's oldest estates without scandal or spectacle. Invitations arrived almost daily. Damian accepted very few. He preferred mornings spent walking the eastern gardens and afternoons reviewing schools, farms, and tenant requests with Evelyn seated beside him, offering observations that invariably noticed the people hidden behind columns of numbers. One bright Saturday, Mrs. Green from the kitchen timidly requested permission to speak with the Duchess. Evelyn expected concerns about supplies or staffing. Instead, the older woman nervously explained that her grandson had received admission to university through a scholarship Damian had personally funded after reading Catherine's old notes about the family's sacrifices. Tears brightened the woman's eyes as she curtsied. "Lady Catherine remembered my daughter. Your Grace remembered my grandson." Evelyn looked toward Damian standing nearby. He appeared almost uncomfortable with gratitude. After Mrs. Green departed, Evelyn smiled gently. "You finally laughed without apologizing." Damian seemed surprised before quietly realizing she was correct. The sound had come naturally. Catherine's unfinished letter had become reality. Weeks later, the physician returned for another examination and spent considerably longer studying Damian's pulse than anyone expected. When he finally removed his spectacles, he shook his head with visible disbelief. "Your Grace, medicine explains many things. Hope continues to challenge all of them." Damian smiled. "I intend to remain a difficult patient." "Mrs. Ellis immediately answered from the doorway. "You always have been." Even the physician laughed. Archive East remained carefully preserved, though its purpose quietly changed. Instead of forgotten mysteries, the rooms now protected letters, family journals, village histories, and ordinary memories collected from servants, gardeners, teachers, and children. Damian insisted that every life surrounding Ravenshire deserved to be remembered. Evelyn added a small reading table beside the eastern window where spring sunlight warmed old pages every afternoon. Above it rested a framed sentence copied from Catherine's final notebook. Good people rarely wake intending to make dishonest choices. They simply become accustomed to small compromises until honesty feels inconvenient. Beneath the quotation another line had been added in Damian's own handwriting. Kindness is how truth finds its way home. Late one evening, as the last light settled across the gardens, Damian and Evelyn walked together toward the newly planted camellias. White blossoms had already begun opening against deep green leaves, gentle and unhurried beneath the fading sky. They stopped beside the oldest tree where a small stone bench overlooked the valley. Neither hurried to speak. Silence had become something entirely different between them. It no longer carried fear of endings. It carried confidence that tomorrow would arrive and find them still walking side by side. Damian finally reached into his coat and removed the first farewell letter he had almost burned completely that winter morning months before. Only one sentence remained legible along the untouched corner. "If I cannot stay, remember that I tried." He looked at the fragile page for a long moment before folding it once more and placing it beneath the roots of the camellia tree. Evelyn watched quietly. "Leaving it behind?" He nodded. "Yes." "Does it hurt?" He considered the question while evening birds crossed the valley toward home. "No." His hand found hers with calm certainty. "Because I finally understand something." She looked toward him. The fading sunlight reflected softly within grey eyes that no longer searched for permission to exist. "The greatest inheritance Ravenshire ever gave me was never land or title." His voice remained steady, warm, and wonderfully alive. "It was the people who refused to let me disappear before I had finished living." Evelyn leaned gently against his shoulder as spring settled peacefully across the estate. Somewhere in the distance children laughed beside the schoolhouse, servants prepared supper with open windows, and white camellias swayed beneath a quiet English sky. The mystery had ended. The records had been restored. The past had found justice. And in the simple ordinary miracle of two people choosing hope every morning, Ravenshire finally became exactly what Catherine, Damian's father, Mrs. Ellis, and every faithful heart had always believed it could be. Not a monument waiting for loss, but a home where kindness endured longer than fear, where truth survived longer than silence, and where love revealed itself not through grand declarations but through the quiet decision to remain.